South Australian president of the Legal Forecast, and I'm so delighted to see so many of you coming out tonight to help us navigate the final frontier. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the land that we meet upon today is the traditional land of the Kaurna people, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Tonight, we have a wonderful evening planned with some excellent panellists ready to help us navigate the boundless potential of space, how we can practically harness this, what's holding us back, and what does this mean for the law. It seems like discussions of space are pretty front and centre in Adelaide at the moment, with the wonderful news of Adelaide becoming the home of the Australian Space Agency late last year, which is a huge win for Adelaide, to the growing presence of space startups such as Newman Space, Myriota, and Fleet, some even placed in our wonderful innovation precinct at Lot 14. There is also the constant work done by Adelaide University in the academic space, with space law moots, topics, and continuous publications by our expert panellists. The potential of space is exciting, and I think that's evidenced by everyone being here in the room today and those of you watching on our live stream at home, all coming out to find out more. At the Legal Forecast, we really look to provide an opportunity for people to come together and discuss issues such as this that are not only fascinating and topical, but have huge implications in the legal realm. For those of you who aren't familiar with TLF, we're a national not-for-profit association that really looks to encourage the next generation of curious leaders. As a matter of advancing legal practice through disruptive thinking and cross-disciplinary discourse. We're really excited about what we can achieve this year in terms of creating that discourse. We'll kick things off with Molly, our wonderful TLF executive team member who has a keen interest in space law after her space economy report for the US Consulate in Melbourne. And she'll be guiding us through a discussion burning through the practicalities and obstacles of space law for roughly 35 to 40 minutes. And then we'll move into a Q&A, so please save all of your burning questions until then. We'll then have some time for networking, so please hang around, get to know each other as we continue to grow our TLF SA community. Before we kick things off, a little bit of housekeeping. So the bathrooms are just outside and to your right. Please make sure that all of your phones are switched to silent. And I'd like to say a huge thank you to the Adelaide University Next Steps program and Runway, which is the research unit on military law and ethics, for sponsoring us this evening, sharing their knowledge on our panel, and also allowing us to put on this event, which could not have happened without them. I'd also like to thank our wonderful partners, the Young Australians of International Affairs, and also the Australian Youth Aerospace Association for sharing their insights and helping us shape this event and bring you all here tonight. And lastly, as always, don't hesitate to get on the socials, so take some photos of the event and spread the word, and we will be using the hashtag TLFAdelaide. So without further ado, I'd love to introduce our panellists, as we really are so lucky to have such an expert panellist with a range of industry expertise here with us tonight. So first of all, we have Professor Melissa Deswart, who is the Dean of Law at Adelaide University. She's a board member of the Space Industry Association of Australia and the Space Security Index, a member of the International Institute of Space Law, and co-editor of the Wimmera Manual on the International Law of Military Space Operations, and more. We have Dr. Dale Stephens, who is the Director of the University of Adelaide Research Unit on Military Law and Ethics, RUMLE, the Director of the Adelaide Military Law Program, and Head of the Combined SA and Northern Territory Naval Legal Reserve Panel. Dr. Stephens is also captain in the Royal Australian Navy Reserve, who spent over 20 years as a permanent officer in the Royal Australian Navy and a member of the International Institute of Space Law. We also have Joel Lisk, who is a PhD candidate at the University of Adelaide and graduate law clerk at Cal Clark. His PhD research focuses on how nations legislate for commercial space activities, including how regulation can impact on commercial obligations, international treaty materials, subsidiary resources on international law and domestic law and policy. We have Scott Schneider, who is a solicitor at Jones, Harley and Toole in Adelaide, where his work focuses on identifying and addressing the needs of startups in the Australian space sector. He is an active member of the Australian and New Zealand Space Law Interest Group and is the administrator of the Australian Space Capability Database for the Space Industry Association of Australia. And finally, we have Thomas Green, who is an experienced research and policy analyst at Newman Space and is currently undertaking a PhD focusing on the regulation and enforcement of new technology. He has an extensive history working in the aerospace and defence industry and currently focuses on the research and development, intellectual property, government legislative reform, space law, and the migration of anti-competitive conduct in orbit. Please join me in welcoming our panellists. I'll just pass over to Molly and she will kick us off.
Okay, well, I will not waste too much time because we do have a very large panel with us tonight, which is very exciting. But I just wanted to let everyone know that for those of you who are watching at home and have any burning questions, you can use the hashtag TLFSpaceQ to submit your questions, and we'll have some of our TLF members going through that feed and selecting some to announce at the panel. So first, to start off, I just wanted to ask what got each of the panelists interested in space. What was your journey? What excites you about space law?
Let's kick us off.
Well, I met Patty in 2005 when I was an undergrad at Sydney University, and I left in 2010. I spent about 10 years working in startups, worked in private sector finance, venture capital, private equity, and throughout all that he was doing his PhD research, and in about 2014, 2015, I was looking to commercialise, and I switched my JD, and they need someone on the team just to help with setting up the company and getting the ball rolling. And I was looking at one of their business models and how it could be improved to generate some revenue. So I put something together, sent it off to Patty and the then CEO, and about a week later I got an email back saying, we really liked your work, do you want a job? And I thought it was too crazy to say no to. So I thought, yeah, cool. So I never thought I'd be doing space, I never thought I'd be here. I fell into this, and I'm really glad I did.
How crazy was it when you did say yes?
It was super crazy. My missus, I said, like, I need to talk to my partner about it, and she came home from work, and she said, you know, how's the day? I said, look, I got this job, I'm doing space. She said, what do you say? I said, I talked to you, she said, you're an idiot, call him now.
I'm Scott. I just recently moved to Adelaide. My interest in space was quite naive. I started off practice as a criminal lawyer up in Queensland, and then I wanted to pursue a bit more, see if I could discover if my passion could eventuate into anything practical to do with the space sector. So I, through searching Google and many other websites, I found the International Space University's summer program here in Adelaide, which is every summer for the last few years and for a few years more. I did that in the start of 2017, and that was a fantastic opportunity for not only existing professionals in the sector to come and build their knowledge in other disciplines, but also for people like myself who didn't have any knowledge of the space industry or how to play a part in it, to build that knowledge base and start making those very important connections that really are valuable and become more valuable the more effort you put into the industry. From there, I've maintained my relationship with that university and helping them with other programs. And I did some work for the Space Industry Association of Australia last year, as Barbara mentioned, helping them with the database of Australia's collective capabilities across professional services such as insurance and finance and legal, and also the more operational and engineering aspects. And then finally came to Adelaide in January to start applying that into the practical world of legal practice for small businesses and SMEs. And very, very happy to have come to Adelaide for all the reasons Barbara mentioned. And I'm not the only one who's been drawn here from interstate because of what's happening with Adelaide and also the space community here.
So I'm more of the stereotypical space nerd as a kid. So as a kid I had a picture of Andy Thomas up on the wall, autographed. It's like, yep, this is pretty cool. Tons of Lego on space, like who doesn't? But then in high school I worked out that physics wasn't for me, and neither is maths, so law it is. And then through all the amazing opportunities the Adelaide Law School offers, I can kind of have the opportunity to jump back into that interest from a kid into space, and from there it's kind of just flourished into the commercial space industry and what we have now.
Thank you, Joe. So, I don't know, is this on? Can you hear? Can you hear me just without this, or can you hear me with this? Yeah, it's a bit. So 1969, I think not many of you, I think, were even alive in 1969 in the room. I was in reception, and that was the year that Neil Armstrong walked on the moon. And we got to play that out in reception. I'm 5 years old, and I got to be Michael Collins. Nobody's heard of him. He's the guy that did not land on the moon. And I got to sort of revolve around my friends who, in the school play, landed on the moon. And so that, I don't know if that caused any sort of psychological... But then through the 70s, it seemed that humanity knew no bounds. We had multiple visits back to the moon. We had the Viking landers on Mars. We had the Voyager satellite that went out to find new worlds. We had the space shuttle. And it seemed that we were just progressing constantly, exponentially. And then it all sort of ended in the 1980s. And for me, that was the end of a road, I thought. But then, as was mentioned, I was in the Navy, and my job in the Navy was mostly operational law. And towards the end of my career in the Navy, I started to see, as Director of Operations in International Law, I started to see more space-related things coming across my desk. So we were fighting in Afghanistan, we were drawing down in Iraq, we had operations all over the place, and I started seeing space things come across my desk. And it dawned on me then that we, in the ADF at least, were very reliant on space assets for everything, for land, sea, air operations. And so space, for me, became operationally very, very relevant. And the legal regime behind it, which we were never taught at all, I needed to learn more about that. And when I left the ADF and took up the position here at Adelaide Law School, I certainly brought that enthusiasm with me. And with someone called Duncan Blake, who some of you might know, who I used to work with, he actually, my very first day at Adelaide Law School, before I even walked through the door, he was at the gateway telling me that this was an opportunity for Adelaide to work more in space law, and I could only agree with him. So from there we developed what we developed. That's my story. It's my Australian story.
So I had a very much more boring background. I went into practice in a large firm in Melbourne. I'd already developed a significant interest in intellectual property. So I was working in the IP department, and from there I went to work in-house at CSIRO. So for a number of years I managed the in-house legal department at CSIRO, and I realised that not only was I obsessed with science fiction, but I was a pretty hardcore nerd in all ways. So for me that was the ideal place to practice law, because you were working with your client, you were CSIRO, you knew who your client was, and you were engaged in looking at all sorts of cutting edge technology. I'm old enough that I was basically at CSIRO when we started using email on a regular basis. So when I became an academic, I pretty much picked up from there looking at all things cyber. We didn't call it cyber in those days, we called it something far more boring like the internet, possibly even incorrectly the World Wide Web. But that's sort of where my interest grew. So when the Elon Musks of the world moved into the space program, I kind of followed them into the space domain, because all of the disruptive thinking that those people, and now of course the startups and the entrepreneurs that we have here in Adelaide, are reinvigorating the space environment through the new ways of doing things, new fuels, new materials, new uses, new ways of looking at space that had stagnated under the sort of old model. So I started looking at the commercial applications of space. I started working with Dale on the Woomera manual on the military uses of space. And I also have a particular interest in the place of South Australia as a space state. So looking back at the importance of Woomera and what that means in terms of the opportunity that Australians had in that time, in the 60s, to be involved again in a completely disruptive industry. So you had the establishment of a whole lot of new scientific endeavours. You had the work being done by the physics department here at Adelaide, all on a shoestring at a point in time where had the Australian government successively on both sides actually decided to continue to fund the space industry, we could be in a completely different space than we are now. And I think it's really important that we recognise the importance of technology to our society and really back ourselves, and that's why it's so important that we get behind the space agency, that we get behind our startups, we get behind our entrepreneurs and support them in what they're doing, because the investment in technology is absolutely fundamental to our future as a country. So that's what I want to, that's why I'm involved in space, and that's what I want to contribute to. I don't need it. Okay. I quickly want to get it's a hot potato.
Thank you all for sharing your interesting and diverse pathways to a passion for space. I just wanted to jump onto what Melissa said there. How have you found, with this passion for space, that the outdated legislative framework has actually inhibited that passion in the space sector?
Joel is the expert on this.
So, I don't know if many of you would know, but Australia has a space regime domestically, and we also have to comply with our international obligations. So our international obligations were generally formulated in the mid-60s with the Outer Space Treaty, and then a couple of others followed on from there, like the Liability Convention and the Registration Convention Agreement and the rest of them. But Australia's domestic legislation, which is the one that actually impacts commercially, entered into force in '98. So at the time, we're talking big rockets, big satellites, what we're used to seeing in movies from that era. And what we've recently seen is a resurgence of the space industry in Australia and globally going towards something that's a lot smaller, towards something that's a lot lower cost. And at this point in time, our legislation doesn't necessarily do that. So it stands as quite a significant commercial barrier in that sense. We have had reform, so it may change. Can't say officially yet. But the commercial barriers to space generally relate to cost. I think Thomas might have been with this one too.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so Space Activities Act reform. I remember when Stephen Friedland was talking about how he was heading the inquiry to look at the amendments to that with Christopher Pyne, who was the Minister of Rail at the time. That was in 2015. It was in Sydney. It was the Off Earth Mining Conference. I think was where they announced it actually. And it's been going through a fair bit of work since then. So there's still public consultation on for the remainder of this month and next month, I believe. And then that's going to close. So they have introduced the amendments already, but they're looking at continued public consultation. It's an ongoing process. It's going to be about 4 years. Actually, the next one here in Adelaide will be on 6th of June. So if anyone wants to go and have a look and meet the Australian Space Agency and talk to them about what you can potentially submit for, that'd be good. I'll be the one in Canberra, that's 11th of June. So for those of you who might not be in Adelaide at the time, that's worth going to as well. In terms of the problems over the Australian Space Activities Act, it was introduced in the 90s. There was a bit of hope and promise we're going to have a spaceport up in northern Queensland and potentially one in Christmas Island. The casinos were starting to wind up at that point in time. They're looking for a new business model. They went another direction, which is fine. But there was a lot of promise about maybe looking for spaceports there to tap into the then burgeoning tiger economies. The tiger economies collapsed in '98. The funding never really came forward, so we introduced this legislation around these big activities in the 90s without really much fanfare. So we're the sixth nation on Earth to actually have legislation for space, and the rules have been a bit tighter than what you find in other countries. This has arguably resulted in a race to the bottom, with a lot of people going jurisdiction shopping to find the place at their startups. I'll be honest, I haven't actually seen it myself firsthand, but I'm told that this is on a broader scale a bit of a concern. So one of the ideas of amending the Space Activities Act is to cut that red tape down. So one of the ones I think Job always has a better idea of this is the insurance elements, bringing that down as well. I think also just the fees for you got to pay for lodgement. Yeah, they're a bit tight, particularly for a startup. I mean, even something like Nimbus Space, we could probably cover that well enough. But if you're, so for example, ResearchSat, which is a company in Adelaide developing an IO box, it's 2 people. I think it's like lodging the fees. It's a couple of $100. It's a bit exy for 2 people.
40 grand at the moment.
Oh, okay. Sorry. No, that's actually that's the launch. Yeah, for launch. No, I'm talking about even just filings.
Oh, so just to start a company.
You get nickel and dimed just in submitting material. So yeah, it's so I think it's a bit exy, and having that change would be good. So yeah.
To make a comment on not necessarily on what hindrances there are or opportunities, but the reason why it's important to consider these legislative amendments and try and make them work for launches in Australia is because not only does it foster our small companies here in our research organisations, but it also has an opportunity to be attractive to foreign companies and foreign entities who want to do activities here. So by allowing ourselves to have easy access to space, it also allows another greater global market to focus on Australia to come here and then thereby supporting our space environment as well.
So on that point, we've got a project going which has been sponsored by the South Australian Law Foundation, which is called the Angels Project. I did not come up with the name. I don't think I would have called it that if it had been up to me, but nevertheless, that's what it's called, which has been organised by Duncan Blake. And it has been quite an exercise, and we have Claudia down here at the front here, who is one of the angels, and I'm sure she loves me calling her that. And the purpose of that project is to literally to identify what the impediments are under the current regulatory regime to uses of space, access to space in the broadest sense, and to gather that information and to collate that and use that in a way to develop a web-based resource which will be useful for people in the space industry knowing what kind of regulatory hurdles they want to or they need to jump through. So to identify the legislative regime, which bits of it they need to know, which bits they need to apply to, what the licences are, and then more broadly than that, they've gathered a lot of information about specifically what the risks and impediments are. Is that just about it? Is that about right? Yeah. So it's an ongoing project, obviously, but the purpose of that is to provide a free resource to the industry that they can at least begin with. You know, what do they need to know? What road do they need to travel down?
Perfect. Okay, I just wanted to shift the conversation a little bit now because I'm sure many people in the audience have heard some concerns about the militarisation of space. So perhaps Dale could talk a little bit about how military interests are infringing on space as a global resource.
That's kind of a loaded question. So let's be clear that the military were the ones who went into space in the first place, and let's be clear that military activity has been the foundation for space activity forever. So that has not changed. What the Outer Space Treaty does, it does actually provide for limitations on certain military activity. The placement of weapons of mass destruction in full orbit around the Earth. It does prohibit the establishment of permanent bases on the Moon, military bases on the Moon or any other celestial body. But beyond that, it doesn't have any other prohibition. And states are correct in saying that they can put any weapon they like up in space, provided that it is not a weapon of mass destruction. And this becomes an issue. It becomes an issue in terms of international law because the Outer Space Treaty is a very ambitious treaty and a very aspirational treaty. And for many, it is the answer to everything to do with space. And therefore, it's a bit limiting in the subtleties of military operations. Article 3 of the Outer Space Treaty does in fact incorporate all other international law, and the challenge in terms of military activity in outer space is understanding a nuanced and sophisticated legal regime that can apply to regulate military activity and to provide a basis for non-escalation. So it's a subtle point that I'm making that I might need to expand on, and that is the Outer Space Treaty is the starting point, but international law more generally is, I think, how we're going to, what's the word, blunt military imperialism to enable freedom in space, or whatever the loaded question was. So I think that's the answer. But here's the thing: with non-state entities going into space, private companies going into space, and going into space much more cheaply and much more readily than ever before, the legal regulation that's contained in the Outer Space Treaty may not be up to the task of states and individual companies doing things in space. And once one national is affected, then the military is going to be asked to get involved. And when the military gets involved, you're going to want to know what the law is about what can and can't be done. And that's why Adelaide University, in conjunction with Nebraska University, Exeter University, and University of New South Wales, Canberra, is leading in the Warmer Manual to try and articulate what the law actually will be to limit military activity, to de-escalate tension, and to understand what the boundaries and trip lines are. So that's the challenge. That's the big challenge for the future.
Does anyone else have anything? Okay, so just going from that, obviously space was traditionally the domain of governments and large defence companies. Now that we're seeing a rise in space startups, how do you think lawyers or the government could better facilitate innovation within this space startup sector?
I actually just want to now go back to follow on from the Dale point, and the thing I want to talk about is the Indian ASAT test. Okay, so if we're talking about the issue of militarisation of space becoming problematic, I think we need to be very careful when we talk about civil uses of space. So this sort of leads on to your question. So the Indian ASAT test is not prohibited under international law. However, it was possibly the most irresponsible thing that has been done in the space domain in the most recent time. So admittedly, other countries have done ASAT tests, have created vast debris fields, etc., etc. But we know now much more about the problems of the debris field. So you had the Indian ASAT test, you had the Indian government saying that it had been conducted in a responsible manner, that the angle of it had been to push the debris down into LEO to facilitate the disintegration, the burning up of that debris as it entered the atmosphere. But in fact, the analysis that's been done suggests that in fact a lot of it has gone up. But why I raise this point in the context of your question is because this test has caused significant problems for operators in the commercial space industry. So it's caused launch cancellations, it has caused risks of debris to the space station, but also to operators like Planet in terms of what they're doing. So it is not a question solely, I would say, about, well, is there sort of like a safe and responsible civilian or governmental or commercial use of space versus a non-safe military use of space. You have to have a regime that operates to facilitate maximum access to the space domain. So the issue of space traffic management is going to become absolutely crucial. So for a lawyer, they need to be aware not only of the international regime, the domestic regime, but also really what the key elements of being able to operate responsibly in space will be. And they may include things like debris mitigation guidelines. They may include things like ATAR and export controls, and they may, importantly now, I think, include contributing on a global basis to establishing how we can all have a continued access to the space domain. So I think that straddles both questions.
So on the topic of what lawyers can do in practice, what I think we need to recognise is that we need, in the innovation sense, we need to realise we're not there to be a stop sign. So we go, you've got a problem, it doesn't look like it fits legally, but what can we do then to make sure it does comply? Not just stand there and go, you paid us 10 grand, we're saying no, but go, you paid us 10 grand, this is what you can do so we can say yes. And I think it's very easy for anyone who's done law before to go, that says that, so that means no, try again later. And I think it's important for us as lawyers and as people going into the field to go, no, we need to work on being able to find answers and solutions rather than just being no, because any startup who has to fork out a ton of money for legal advice doesn't want the answer to be no.
And just on that, as a practitioner, assisting the innovation of space would be, one way of doing that is by assisting the startups in space, not only from the space regulatory point of view, but also for the generalist practice point of view as well. So their business matters, their financial strategy, their access to market, and being along that journey with them. Startups have a pretty particular need that quite often requires bespoke advice and guidance from all their professional service providers, not just lawyers. And so the challenge is, that I've been finding is really understanding what they're going through, not only their passions and what their outcomes are, but what their challenges are, and feeling those challenges and also their achievements. So that's something that private practitioners can do. From a regulatory perspective, I think it's important that the consultation for the benefit of innovation is having quite intimate consultation with startups and stakeholders with that interest in the startup sector. So beyond going with consultation papers, once the regulations are in force, or are drafted and come into force, rather than a startup or small business having to try and navigate it, even with the wonderful help of angels, and then go to a regulator and say, this is what I've got, is this right or is this wrong? This is how I think. Is having that regulator also, in a way, part of the process and helping them guide them or at least appreciate where they're coming from, and to provide not necessarily support, but to be understanding and not just be, like Joel said, that stop sign, and take it as a more holistic approach. What would you like to see?
What would I like to see? Yeah, I've actually been thinking about this for the last few years, and I think it should be registered exclusive rights of practice when it comes to space law. So obviously the legal system, we've been moving towards removing exclusions to certain types of legal matters. So for example, conveyancing was spun out of black letter law in the practitioner's field back in the early 90s. And this is good. This is a good idea on the whole because it reduces costs, it provides more accessibility. But some things you might want to actually look at providing a registered exclusive right to practice in. For example, patent laws. If you're a legal practitioner, you can't do patents unless you're a registered patent attorney. And we do this because with patents, if you disclose something into the public domain and you've got your claims wrong, they're too broad, they're too narrow, or they just don't satisfy the requirements, it can be very hard to go back once in the public domain and someone may have infringed on it, worked on it, to then rework it. Similarly with space, it's not just a matter of you doing employment contracts, your staff, or you're also your overseas launch certificates, although that's that too. As mentioned previously, you've got ITAR, you've got EAR to deal with exports administration regulations. ITAR, for those who don't know, is international traffic and arms regulations. So if you work in space, you're working in the defense sector, which means everything you traffic, typically in the United States, is considered to be on a schedule. Some things are. And if you get that wrong, it can end very badly. In point of fact, I was using this room with the Department of Defense about a year ago, where at great length they explained how badly it can go. Other things too, contract service launch, you're on the ground, you're having your indemnity set up correctly, and the rocket doesn't quite go the direction you want to go in. You might have some liabilities. You want to make sure you've indemnified yourself properly so that you don't end up footing the bill, either to the people who are launching or to the people you're launching on behalf of, or your third parties as well. So I think there should actually be a move to be made to actually have it as a registered legal practitioner, specifically for space. I think it'd be better for the startup scene on the whole, because there's a lot of different issues to navigate. And yeah, I have situations where I had to educate legal practitioners on these things, and that's fine. But I think going forward as an industry, I think it's better if that knowledge is already pre-existing and comes through the law society, so that we get the right information for the general public. Alongside that as well, it might be considered to have an accreditation scheme for licensed practice. I think at the moment NASA has about 40 astronauts, and the pedigree of those astronauts is historically military or university, which have fit problem persons tests already inbuilt into those streams. So there's not really much scope for people being bad actors or acting in bad faith or being negligent or reckless necessarily. But as it opens up to the private sector, and not just necessarily private sector astronauts, but which won't be so likely, at least not immediately, but even ground station staff, it might be wise to look at an accreditation scheme for people being licensed to operate. If I've got to get a license to drive a car, it's foreseeable I should probably have a license to pilot a satellite. So that's probably worth exploring as well from the startup end. I mean, I know it's rare to have someone say, we need more regulation, but I think this time that would be wise, yeah.
Okay, thank you. So following this conversation about how practitioners can help innovation within the space sector, I'm sure a number of members within our audience are keen to get into the space sector. So what are the kind of the most promising jobs or areas that you see for people looking to break into space law?
Not mine.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm really pleased. I only met Thomas for the first time tonight, but that's fantastic that the startup who has moved to Adelaide and has employed someone with this kind of knowledge in their core team. That's fantastic, and if you're interested to do something like that with your expertise that you gain along the journey, that would be pretty invaluable. Whether it's particularly focused on space or on other aspects of business, such as IP or on the management of your finances, etc., or corporate structure. So that's one opportunity that probably could be more employed in the startup space. But of course, having staff is always one of those big challenges that especially early stage startups face. But that's certainly a suggestion. Otherwise, private practice, providing those services as an advisor is another way.
So I really early on, I think maybe my third year of law, I got this little tip of advice from a career space lawyer, Michael Davis, who used to be the chairperson of the Space Industry Association of Australia. And he said to me, if you want to work in space, the best thing to be is to be a generalist commercial lawyer. Because first off, you have that ability to advise and to provide information to your client, whoever they may be, on a broad variety of subjects. So you don't just go, I only know this licensing regime, I've got no idea what your corporation structure is, and I don't care. It's actually important to know those things, because if you're a company, you have to execute documents in a certain way, you need to apply for the licenses in a certain way. So I'd say that an important point in private practice is to be a generalist lawyer. And then I was at an event the other day, and there was Pam Melroy, who's a former astronaut who works as a company director here in Adelaide now, and she was talking about all these variety of different things. As a director, she has to consider the consulting, the liability, it's part of the law, and a whole variety of business things. So space isn't just about, well, space isn't just about space law, space isn't just about space engineering, it's about a whole variety of different things and auxiliary careers and opportunities around that.
I think Joel is absolutely right, and it's the same advice that James Crawford, some of you might know, is a judge at the International Court of Justice, who was a graduate of our law school and was a professor here. He made the comment that if you want to be an international lawyer, just be a general lawyer first, and then develop your legal skills, and then specialise in international law. And I think that's what Joel was saying, and I agree with that. I think for South Australia, I think right now, the job market for lawyers in space is very small, but I think we're about 5 years away from it actually becoming a thing. And the reason I say that is that Melissa and I were recently in Arizona at an event, and in Arizona, we were the only lawyers in a room that was full of engineers and astronauts and policy people and writers and anybody who had anything to do with space. We had to go through, in this room of about 40 people, what were the big issues that was confronting humanity in regards to space. And believe it or not, the number one issue was the legal regime. We were the only two lawyers there, so it wasn't us that were talking. It was recognised by everybody, and we had people from Blue Origin and from SpaceX and NASA and the big names. And in the breakouts and in the social meetings, many people spoke to us about the myriad of legal issues that they and their companies have to navigate. So this is in the United States. We're behind them, obviously, given our recent start in this field. But I think in the next 5 years, it's going to come to fruition. So fortunately, Adelaide Law School offers a postgraduate course in space law. But the thing about that we're finding, typically perhaps for South Australia, is that the vast majority of our students are from overseas or from interstate. We do get a smattering of South Australian students in our postgraduate course, but I'm glad we're attracting people to our state that are from other states for startups, but for lawyers, I think the law students and graduates from other states have worked this out way before we have here. So this is a golden opportunity. I am shamelessly plugging this course. This is a golden opportunity for you to do space law at Adelaide Law School.
So I'll take a slightly different tack, and I'll say that for me, the important thing is to actually love the tech as well. Okay, so if you just want to be a space lawyer because you want to get rich and tell people you're a space lawyer, it could happen, but I think to really provide, good service to your clients and really get fulfillment, you need to really actually understand how the thing works and care about that. So I'm constantly shocked by people who talk about the rules of international law, for example, as they apply to space, and they don't understand what the basic principle of orbit is all about. And I think it gets back to the point about, not charging your client for you to reinvent the wheel. So one of the biggest problems that I had at CSIRO was I was there at the point where they were starting to allow the divisions, as they were then called, to outsource their work. So what happened was, and you people in private practice should shut your ears now, is that they would come along to the scientists and take them out for very expensive lunches and woo them with all the trappings of a high-end law firm, and they would say, great, we'll do your work for you now. And so then, a few months later, I'd get a phone call from one of the scientists or engineers saying, I've got this bill for $150,000. What am I going to do about it? I can't pay this. You've got to get me out of this. So what happened? It's like, well, I went to company X or firm X and asked them to draft me a non-disclosure agreement. But they didn't understand the technology, so I had to educate them about it. I had to take them to the facility, and I had to tell them how it worked, and I had to tell them who the disclosure was with and what we wanted to do with it. So you do understand you were paying them for every single billable unit when you were educating them about your business. So, I think being a good lawyer is understanding all of those, fundamental things about, what is required, what the business model is, what the science is, what the purpose of it is, what a CubeSat is. Those sorts of things I think are really important. You can't be a good lawyer unless you at least have a working knowledge. Would you say, how deep does that knowledge need to be? And I think an affection for it as well. Would that be fair? Yeah. So I think that is an important adjunct. You've got to kind of care about the industry that you're trying to work in.
Or have an appreciation of the areas.
Yeah. And there's lots of ways you can do that. There's you don't have to go and do a physics degree, but talking to people, reading up, reading books, looking at just issues about, documentaries. There's lots of great documentaries, but learning a bit about the physics and the workings of that industry is really important.
Yes, definitely. Okay, so I think our time is up for my questions. So I might just throw it to the audience now if anyone has any questions that they'd like to ask the panel. Yes.
I've got a bit of a pros here, so I'll start with that. US and Luxembourg have anticipated that mining and the moon or other celestial bodies is permissible and have enacted domestic law to facilitate it. There are models that show mining some minerals in space, for example helium-3 and platinum, are becoming economically feasible. Now, if my facts are up to date, China has been silent on the issue, and Russia has stated its belief that space mining is not legal. Can you rationalise these viewpoints? And how long until we see space mining?
So
You going on?
there you go. She is my dean.
So, it's, I think, taking your last question first, it's not far away. And remembering, of course, that one of the most important purposes of space mining will be to facilitate further exploration of the solar system. So generally, we're not talking about mining for the purposes of bringing resources back to Earth, because that's prohibitively expensive. We already have space mining companies that have been established and have boomed and have bust as well. So we're now in that, and I can never remember the name of it, that graph, you know, the Valley of Doom and the whatever of despair and the, you know. So we're in that. We're in that cycle with space mining now. I'm not really sure exactly which bit we're in, but we're somewhere in there now. So it is coming. Now, in terms of the question is it legal? Is it legal under international law? And your answer to that is, that any law student would say, what are the two magic words? Is it legal?
It depends.
Thank you. That's exactly right. So it depends who you are and how you interpret that law, and to some degree also whether you are a party to the Moon Agreement. So Australia is a party to the Moon Agreement, and I know that it's a very hotly contested topic. There are many people who think we should now withdraw from the Moon Agreement. None of the major spacefaring nations are parties to the Moon Agreement, and that is the one that is most restrictive about resource utilisation. Now, one of the important things to remember about this is it is going to be largely done by way of autonomous vehicles, so we're not talking about people going up there doing this thing. And then you've got the next question is, if you are silent on it, does that mean that you are not intending to do it, or does that mean that you're just intending to do it and you're not going to tell anyone about it?
So just following on from that, my view, the framework is that under Article 2 of the Outer Space Treaty, you cannot claim sovereignty, you can't nationally appropriate any celestial body by way of claims of sovereignty or otherwise. And so what Luxembourg and the United States are saying is that we're not claiming sovereignty over an asteroid or other celestial body. We're not doing that. We're extracting the minerals and the proceeds for further space exploration. Now, the International Institute of Space Law came out with a statement on that was which was absolutely sitting on the fence. We all agree you can't appropriate a satellite. We all agree an asteroid. We all agree that whether or not this violates that or not, we can't say. So what you do is you go to the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, you look at Article 31, 3b, that talks about subsequent state practice. And subsequent state practice can inform treaty meaning. Back to the point that Melissa was talking about what states say or don't say. If states, Russia, yes, has made a statement that they think this is illegal. Other states have been silent, and other states are saying we tacitly agree. The answer to this question is in the near future, depending on how state views coalesce around the interpretation of Article 2. That's not a satisfactory answer, but I think my bet is that states are going to conclude that it is not illegal and that therefore it is possible. That's my bet. I think that's where we're going to end up.
Yes, a question there.
As you've been speaking about some of the, especially you, Thomas, about if we programmed the rocket slightly off and like it goes the wrong way and there's private liability and things like that, with this influx of, I guess you call them non-state actors in a traditionally international field, do you think the state responsibility is sufficient to cover all the potential thing that might happen to like at an international scale?
Yes, so excellent question. So one of the things that happened in the 1960s, when myself and two other people were actually alive in this room, was that the United States and the Soviet Union had a disagreement about the role of we knew about whether or not private companies had any sort of place in space. And the United States was an advocate for private companies and entities going to space. The Soviet Union was not. And in 1967, it didn't seem likely. It seemed a bit of a thing in the future. So Article 6 of the Outer Space Treaty is a compromise. And what that says is, it seems to modify traditional concepts of state responsibility. What it says is that if I'm a private company and I go into space, then my state is on the hook for anything that I do. And that's a different rule, of course, to what exists in normal principles of state responsibility, which requires attribution, some sort of connection, as wide as they are. So this is almost a strict liability thing, that if I go up there and destroy things, my state is on the hook under the Outer Space Treaty and the Liability Convention, potentially for what I've done. So it's a very unique regime for space. But what that has meant, that's meant that states like Australia are very risk averse, and licence fees and insurance premiums are astronomical, because if we're on the hook, then you're going to pay for that indirectly. And it's been a restraint. Whereas in the United States, it's a more risk-accepting culture there in terms of private entity activity.
Just to add to that, in this year, the Cabinet Papers for 1998 the federal government released, and that was the year that our Space Activity Act came into force. And so rushing to grab a hold of that in the beginning of January, like everyone would be. About 40 pages of cabinet documents, more than half of them were based on liability. So under the regime, Australia, as I was alluding to, is financially responsible for everything that private actors do. So if your CubeSat was to hit the space station and you're an Australian, well, Australia's going to be paying a lot of money. So the vast majority of law in the domestic sense is based on offsetting Australia's liability, pushing it as far onto the private actor as possible. And that's where we face all those issues regarding if your rocket flies a little bit off and you kill someone, the country is liable if they're not in Australia. How do we then make the individual operator of that rocket personally liable? We do that through domestic legislation.
Yeah, sorry, I was just going to, on that. So who then is my state? Is it where my company is incorporated?
It's
the
state of registration. So there's a registration convention. It's the state of registration. So I need to register. If I'm going to go into space, I need to register much like a ship, I need to register my space object.
And to make it more complicated, Australian legislation deals with it based on nationality and location. So it's a mix of a whole bunch of different jurisdictional principles in international law.
I don't know if we mentioned yet, the difference in the liability is now changed with the amended Act. So it's been reduced from 700 million that as a private entity or research organisation you would be liable to pay the state, and it's now 100.
That's all.
Okay, any other questions? Yep, just there.
So liability is what comes after X happens. So if X happens, you're liable for Y. Whose job is it to ensure that X doesn't happen? So, for example, we're mining the moon, right? We already know climate change has had the effects that it has on the Earth. What if something catastrophic like that happens with the moon? Whose job is it to prevent that, to prevent the point of liability from occurring?
So at the moment, I mean, there's nothing, there's no environmental impact statement type obligation as such in any international instrument. There is a requirement to have due regard, but due regard to other states, not to the environment per se. So you would then, if you were going to make a case that somebody is liable for environmental damage, which I think is what your question is, then you would then rely on Article 3 of the Outer Space Treaty to say that general international law applies, and you'd mount an argument under that. But it's going to be hard. It's going to be very hard because there's nothing in the Outer Space Treaty regime that expressly deals with the point you're raising.
Well, what I would say as well to that, though, is if you did touch a human space satellite with your disaster, I'd be coming to the liability convention, so that's how I see it as well.
Just in the back corner there.
I was just thinking, so given that like another satellite's being destroyed in orbit, how pressing is it that as a matter that this issue of like how to destroy defunct satellites or satellites you don't want, because it's all well and good for us to talk about going into space, but if there's too much debris and we can't get there, then like all of this is kind of pointless.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's a great question. It seems, perversely, it seems that you've arrived as a major state if you can blow up one of your own satellites, which is a terrible measure for having arrived in the international scene. But you're absolutely right. There is, at the moment, there's this obligation of due regard. There's the liability convention that you've got to take into account, but that's based on negligence. If I've done all of my, in space, it's based on negligence. So if I've done all of my calculations and I don't anticipate that there's going to be any immediate damage, then I've probably discharged my obligation vis-a-vis negligence. And you're right, you've now got thousands of pieces of debris whizzing around orbit at 20,000 kilometres per hour plus, and there's nothing expressly that stops that. So there needs to be, and there's developing an idea of if you're going into space now, a bit back to that question I just had earlier, that, yes, you, that if you're going into space, you've got to have a plan, an environmental impact plan, a debris mitigation plan, but that's all still soft law. Until this becomes, until people are paying money, literally paying money out for liability or whatever, you're not, I don't think there's a lot of incentive. It's just you're relying on hope that countries will act responsibly. At the moment, it's my view. I don't know if anybody has a different view.
Well, what I was going to add to that is the issue of dual-use space technology. So you've got a number of companies now in various countries who are developing technology for debris remediation or debris removal or whatever you want to call it. But the problem with that is the same technology that you use to sort of deorbit a satellite or even maybe to refuel the satellite is exactly the same sorts of technology that you could use to destroy or to interfere with or to do something destructive or hostile to that satellite. So I think that the issue of dual-use technology, which is particularly prevalent in the outer space context, is probably impeding the kind of debris removal, debris mitigation industry. Lots of great ideas, but everyone sort of says, well, you know, that space harpoon that you can use for removing a defunct satellite is pretty handy for damaging one at the same time. So that's a problem.
Just wanted to add on what Dale said about being soft law at the moment. We're at least on the way there, I think, in the sense that the proposed subordinate legislation for the new amendment does require a debris mitigation strategy in order for you to have a space object registered. So how enforceable that is, but at least that's required in order for you to actually have a permit.
There's just one other point. The concept of outer space back in the 60s mirrored a concept of high seas at the same time. The high seas idea is that nobody has sovereignty over the high seas. So we've all got our internal waters, we've got our territorial sea, we've got our contiguous zone, we've got our EZ, and then there's the high seas. And in the high seas, nobody has sovereignty, it's for everybody's use. But with no sovereignty, there's no responsibility. Nobody is responsible for the high seas, so they're being fished to oblivion. And the same regime applies to space. The concept was no sovereignty, as we've discussed for mining, no sovereignty for anybody in space. And because there's no sovereignty, there's no responsibility. Nobody particularly is responsible for ensuring the maintenance of any sort of order. And there's emerging an argument that there ought to be, perhaps not sovereignty, but some level of authority that states might have, temporary or whatever, in order that they might actually take responsibility for actions in their zone, inverted commas. But again, it's just an interesting idea that's being run by some people.
Okay, someone else? And we might also get Sarah to come down if there's any Twitter questions as well that people watching at home have put through. So maybe Joe at the back.
Going to the other questions regarding the issues, if you're in disputes or problems caused by debris, are there any enforcement mechanisms or entities at the moment, or should we possibly create some kind of enforcement entity like a space court to enforce these things?
So at the moment there is no entity. The occasions where there has been liability arising out of space-type activity, so a Soviet satellite falls to Canada, explodes. It's a state-to-state, 1978 that was, a state-to-state resolution. There was a collision between an American satellite and a Russian satellite a few years ago, again state-to-state. There's been no forum where anybody has gone to claim damages or to seek an independent adjudication of the liability convention. So state on state is the only basis for that. And in fact, have you heard of Skylab? Skylab that fell on Australia in 1979, Western Australia. Again, it crashed in the desert of Western Australia, and the only thing, I don't know if this is apocryphal or true, but the only thing that we could do is the local council fined NASA for littering in that area, and they refused to pay actually until a radio station in America, feeling guilty, raised the $200 I think it was for the littering fee. So that's as good as it got with Skylab.
Do we have a Twitter question? Okay. So we have, if we were to colonize a new planet, how would we go about setting up a new government system? Would it be a United Nations treaty, or how would we go about it?
So this was one of the questions that Dale and I were looking at when we were in Arizona State. And everyone was terribly, terribly excited about looking at international space law and how that would apply and all the issues about how we'd all get along. And then pretty much everyone agreed that once you got to Mars and you were no longer dependent on Earth for your resupply, all bets are off. You just set up a brand new colony and you were Martians from there on in. So as a lawyer, I'd like to say, well, there would be an internationally recognised regime and there'd be a body and blah, blah, blah. But I actually think the best answer to this is, if you haven't already watched a series called The Expanse, then you need to watch The Expanse, because it deals with the fact that once humans leave Earth, Earth is controlled by the all-knowing, all-peaceful, all-wonderful, but all-entirely corrupt UN. And the Martians, Mars was basically settled by a fairly militarised bunch of people, so they're highly efficient. They have the tech, their uniforms are always clean, their weapons are much better than everyone else's, and they run essentially a military colony. And everybody else gets to live on the belt, so they live literally out in space, on space stations, and they're the ones who are dependent on the space mining. So the whole thing starts with the premise where an ice mining ship is attacked, and they are literally getting ice to take it back to the space station so that the humans there who are dependent on water could continue to live. And I think the political scenario that displays is, to my mind, pretty accurate about what's going to happen. But maybe I'm a Philistine. But anyway, there are people in this room who are working on the future of space colonisation. So Stacey Henderson down here might be someone who you can catch up with afterwards who might have a view on that. Anyone else want to discuss the colonisation point?
I might raise the point that it's not all about law and regulation as well, and Henderson would be able to confirm or elaborate on, but there's also a lot of the economic, the governance issues. It'd be a good question to actually ask an anthropologist rather than a regulator first, I think, especially with all the socio-psycho issues and outgrouping, what the relationship was said between Mars and Earth. But to answer the question, I don't think it should come from the UN. Whether the guidance would be appreciated, I'm not sure how effective.
Okay, thank you. I might hand back to Barbara and she can wrap this up. Amazing.
Let's thank our panelists. So thank you to all of you for all of your questions, discussions, and ideas raised tonight. Time and time again, our TLF team are just amazed by everyone's excitement and enthusiasm in coming along to this event. So we really do thank you all for that. We've got a really exciting agenda planned for 2019 that I'm really excited to share with you. And our next event is our flagship Disrupting Law Hackathon. And I'd just like to show you a little bit of a video of what you can expect. So this is Disrupting Law. In the first time in TLF history, we will be running all of our 6 chapters on the same weekend from the 9th to the 11th of August. Live, connected, disrupting and innovating together. Over the weekend, you work with industry representatives to tackle real problems and pitch your final ideas for some excellent prizes. If you'd like to be involved, we'll be announcing some more information in the next couple of weeks. But if you're part of a firm or know a firm who might be interested in sponsoring a team, we do still have a couple of spots left. So keep an eye out for that. If you would like to receive any emails about our future events, what's happening in Adelaide, what TLF is up to, all about our blogs, we do have an iPad for registration out the front, or just leave your name tag as you're leaving the venue tonight. If you would like to be involved with the TLF team, feel free to contact me or anyone in a TLF t-shirt and we can certainly get you on board. And lastly, I'd like to say thank you again to our wonderful sponsors, the Adelaide University Next Steps program and also Rumley, to all of our amazing speakers and each and every one of you for coming out this evening. We do have some more nibbles and drinks outside, so feel free to hang around, ask our panelists any questions you didn't get to ask, and get to know our TLFSA community. Thank you so much.